Okay, good morning. Thank you for offering us a bit of grace here to get a kickstart a little bit late, but would like to welcome you to the Oregon Transportation Commission meeting for April 18th. And the first item that we have is the director's report, but very quickly I'd like to put something on the record, and that is to my colleagues, you will have noticed a letter that came our direction from our governor. She was outlining the importance of the interstate bridge replacement and was essentially giving us the moment of pause to make sure that we are prepared and ready for that conversation with our colleagues in Washington State. Asked that we engage in that discussion and be ready after the state legislature in Oregon concludes, and that we be ready for a conversation that will be of statewide significance in being able to move forward on those discussions. And so you are all in receipt of that letter as well as my response, but wanted to put it on the record that we are in receipt of that and looking forward to those important conversations going forward. So with that, Director Garrett, I will turn it over to you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I appreciate the opportunity to share some thoughts with the Commission. I want to reach back into Commission history. 60 years ago this month, April 1959, Glenn L. Jackson was appointed to the Commission by then Governor Mark Hatfield. Mr. Jackson became Commission Chair in 1962 and was reappointed by Governors Tom McCall and Bob Straub. In total, Mr. Jackson would serve 20 years as a member of the Oregon State Highway Commission and its successor, the Oregon Transportation Commission, 17 of those 20 years as chair. In this role, Mr. Jackson oversaw the delivery of roughly 700 miles of freeway, more than 800 bridges, including the Fremont-Astoria-Megler and the Markham. Notwithstanding these achievements, Mr. Jackson anticipated that building roads, or enough roads, would eventually become impossible. And he became a strong advocate for mass transit and the disciplines associated with land use planning and environmental protection. It should be noted that his daughter, Cynthia J. Ford, also became a member of the OTC and served this commission from January 14, 1987 to September 9, 1996. So, Madam Chair, Addie has a potential role here, just looking ahead. I think to close this out, about someone who played a significant role in this body, there's a little question that Glenn Jackson stands as one of Oregon's most influential figures and truly left his mark through his public service and his corporate leadership. So, a little reach back into Commission history 60 years ago. I want to share with you some of the key performance measures. I'll pull out 5 that I have in front of me right now, specific to vehicle miles travel. For the year to date through February of 2019, it has increased by 4.4% compared to the previous year. Oregon's year-to-date growth is weaker than the state of Idaho, but stronger than Nevada, Washington, and California. As we look at weight mile year-to-date revenue, again, we've seen an increase of about 4.4% through February compared to the previous year here. I think maybe an economic indicator there. We look to the number of surrendered out-of-state licenses from DMV for March. It totaled about 6,600. Cumulatively, there has been about 19,000, a little over 19,000 licenses surrendered through March of 2019. It's a decrease of about 10% from where we were in 2018. You'll recall that 2018 was the second largest surrender of out-of-state licenses, again, speaking to the beauty and the opportunity that the great state of Oregon holds for other folks, and they do migrate their way here. Move to Origo, our road use charge. As of March 19, the total number of Origo participants slipped to about 630, the decline of 4 from the previous month. And I'll wrap this up with passenger rail ridership. It has increased in March of 2019 relative to March of last year. This has pushed the cumulative ridership into the positive territory, up about 1.2% over last year. Madam Chair, that final item I want to share with you is our Transportation Safety Division has garnered a couple significant media awards for all intents and purposes. So I want to extend my congratulations to the Transportation Safety Division, Troy Costalis and his professionals, as we've just learned that 2 of their educational messages won Remy Awards at the World Fest Houston International Gathering. This gathering is one of the oldest and largest film and video competitions in the world. These Remy Award winners were created by our Safety Division Consultant Guard Communication in partnership with the Highway Safety Division team members. So we garnered 2. A gold award went to the message titled Families. It was a campaign designed to increase awareness of work zone safety. And I'd like the Commission to take a look at this very quickly.
Behind every person you see in a work zone is a family. Help make sure everyone gets home safely. When you see orange, pay extra attention, follow the signs, and watch out for workers. Because we all have families to get home to. Respect the zone. It's the way to go.
Proud to say all those good folks are part of the ODOT family. And they first take. They did everything in the first take, from what I understand as well. The second award we garnered was a silver award that went to Are We There Yet? It was a campaign aimed at getting drivers to slow down. We had a little technical difficulty. We tried to share this with you last week, but I'm assured there are no more ghosts in the machines. So let's take a look at Are We There Yet?
Are we there yet? Oh. Are we there yet? Are we there yet? Can't go any faster.
I wouldn't do that.
Where did you come from?
Well, you never know where we're going to be until we're in your rearview mirror.
Hey, I'm not speeding.
Excellent, because I wouldn't want to have to write you a ticket. That would cost you. Slow down. It's the way to go.
So, Madam Chair, I'm happy to tell you that the driver and the passenger are not part of the ODOT family, to be very honest with you. So we're very proud of our safety division, the partners we have at Guard Communication, in helping us communicate the message of safety, which is a value that we hold dear at this department. I know how it is a front and center issue for this commission. Madam Chair, with that, I will stand down.
Thank you, Director Garrett, and congratulations to the team. That's, when it's engaging like that, I think it soaks in a little bit easier. I also, if you don't mind, Director Garrett, I want to note that we, as the state, of course, in February, late February, had the great snow event, and we had significant weather events all across the state. And now we are experiencing the great thaw. And so for the crews that are out there trying to do the work, the cleanup, and make sure that our roadways are safe and passable, please do slow down and make sure that you are encouraging good behavior. Each one of us that slows just a tad slows the cars behind us. So it's an all-in effort to make sure that our teams out there and crews are safe. So with that, I'd like to go ahead with public comment. I have a list of individuals here. Mr. Sworn, I will invite you up first. And good to see the Courtwright brothers here today. Good to see you both. I'll be calling you up soon. So Ron, wonderful to see you as always. Go ahead and hit the button. Make sure it lights up red. Not yet. Not yet. Not yet. Not yet. And this is a theme that'll go throughout the day. We like to make it kind of pesky. So there you
it's
are.
on.
So
Okay.
do state your name for the
I'm
record.
on.
We'll start the clock.
Morning.
Great to see you.
Since you're going to be talking about the I-5 bridge replacement, who knew that would be coming up as a subject? Who knew? I've been interested in that for about 10 years, and I didn't know I'd be working 10 years on it. Early on in the CRC study, they had something they called the Western Arterial Highway, and basically the basic facts: Washington County has provided economic growth in the area, and for some reason a lot of people are moving into Clark County, Washington, and we developed a traveling paradigm that we didn't have before the 90s, and now it's really a major factor. And so yesterday I went to the Washington County Planning Commission. Rich Vial is the chair. He's proposed some various interstate crossings, and some of those are really expensive, very far out in the suburbs. And that's kind of the similar thing with the I-5 bridge replacement. It's a very expensive project. They don't really want to talk about what it would lead to, but if we were to replace that bridge, first of all, the estimate now from Vancouver City Council was $3.3 billion, which I think is probably reasonable because they rebuild a lot of ramps. But then what do you do with all the traffic? That's really the question. What do you do with all, extra 500,000 people moving here? I've read 75% increase in freight. That's just going to keep pouring into Portland. That's really the essential problem. And I know people have talked about, well, we could rebuild I-5. Well, that's a very expensive project. I mean, starting out with a $3 billion bridge and then rebuilding I-5, maybe 10 billion, 15 billion. I know, very expensive, something similar to Seattle. So this is very economical. Anyway, what I'm not seeing in the discussion, we see politics and policy, but we don't see a lot about construction technology. And that's something that's changing, is making certain approaches pretty cost effective. A few months ago, I pointed out the Alsea Bay Bridge built in the 90s, the latest technology, very cost effective. And even the maintenance was only $1.5 million after 25 years. That's really a good deal. So that's what's available on this Western Arterial Highway. There's a lot of ideas that surface, like a tunnel under the river. A lot of people think, well, that's a really good idea. And Seattle Tunnel Partners told me that would be about $5 billion. So when you really look into these options, they get really expensive. And then you have to talk about tolling, and it's a cycle. I think it's a cycle we don't want of poorly thought out projects and more expenses, more taxation, more tolling, etc. It could really go on and on. So anyway, my time's up. So.
Well, as always, thank you for your dedication and interest in this project. As you know, we'll be having
I'm on agenda D,
more,
so.
yep, on D as well, but we look forward to continuing the discussion with you. So I'm Mr. Bob Courtwright. I wasn't sure if you had arm wrestled into who gets to go first, but wonderful to see you. The microphone is on, the floor is yours, and we do have some materials here too.
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair. I was born first, so I'll go first. Chair Boehne, Commissioners, I'm Bob Courtwright from Salem. I really appreciate the opportunity to comment. I want to quickly follow up on the comments that I provided to you last month, and Jackie has additional copies of those. Consent item number 9 today asks that you approve $9 million in federal and state funding for the state's metropolitan areas to do long-range planning and updates of their plans. As you consider this item, please consider where we are and where we need to be going with metropolitan planning to meet our greenhouse gas emission reduction goals. The bottom line with regard to this agenda item is you should take steps now to make sure that funding and technical support can quickly be made available to metropolitan areas to plan for greenhouse gas emission reductions. 2 months from now, it's almost certain that the legislature will approve and the governor will sign House Bill 2020, establishing a cap and invest program and committing the state to major GHG reductions. As you know, this is a big task, and I appreciate that you've committed to make this a major work plan item for the next year, that you're going to do a workshop to get a deeper understanding, and the department is working to align its activities with those of other agencies. These are all good steps, but in addition to that, we need to appreciate that metropolitan areas are going to need a bigger boat if we're going to tackle climate change. We know this because, as I mentioned to you last month, the statewide transportation strategy says we need to reduce driving by about 23% if we're going to meet our greenhouse gas emission goals. And as you just heard the director report, VMT continues to climb. So we're going to need to make reductions. We also know this because none of our MPOs, other than the Portland metropolitan area, are either measuring greenhouse gas emission outcomes or coming up with alternatives or plans that will meet what the STS calls for. We also know this because the department's budget for the next 2 years includes only $300,000 for additional what are called strategic assessments to help metropolitan areas. And frankly, those were an interim device we invented about 5 years ago to get this process started, and they're not really going to help us or metropolitan areas get where they need to be. So there should be some urgency to deal with this and an appreciation that we really need to make changes to metropolitan plans. So again, what I would encourage you to do as you consider this item today is ask and direct the department to look at and reserve funds if necessary and resources to help metropolitan areas undertake this planning. I had a couple of specific recommendations in my letter from March, and I'll leave those with you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Director Garrett, if we could have this as a discussion item, I can talk offline with you about that, but I think an update in terms of the MPO engagement, just in general, and then also this specific item as well would be great. Okay, thank you. Thank you. And I'm sorry, Joe, I'm not sure how it happened, but Doug Allen actually beat you to the punch. So Mr. Allen, please join us. Wonderful to see you. And then, Joe, you are on deck. Mr. Allen, the microphone is ready for you. Please state your name. Great to see you.
Chair Boehne and Commissioners, my name is Doug Allen from Portland, and I'll be referring to the public opinion research on tolling and also the editorial in the April 14th Sunday Oregonian, where once again we hear that tolling won't happen anytime soon. Your polling shows the need for education. It is striking that those who are least likely to be affected oppose tolls the most. However, the most difficult concept is probably the difference between tolling for traffic management and tolling to raise revenue for projects. Both the public and our political leaders need to understand this difference. I was amazed myself when I heard the consultant team present this subject to the Value Pricing Policy Advisory Committee. I learned that tolls needed for congestion relief are much lower than tolls needed for new construction. Tolls should be set at the lowest level needed to keep traffic moving, dropping to zero when there's no congestion. This will maximize roadway capacity and minimize diversion to adjacent streets. At your March meeting, you heard a lot about tolling from California and Washington. I was pleased to hear Catherine Jones, ODOT's Tolling Technology Systems Manager, present the key lesson she learned. An agency intending to implement tolling needs to know if the objective is to raise revenue or mitigate congestion. The information from Washington and California showed how tolling for revenue requires lengthy investment-grade traffic and revenue studies and imposes strict limits on the ability to adjust tolls. Opportunities to tune the system and react to diversion are limited. The Policy Advisory Committee approved the 2 pilot projects recommended to it, with the understanding that tolls from the I-205 project would pay for highway expansion, while the I-5 tolling would be implemented for traffic management. 8 participating organizations sent you a letter asking that any pricing program must focus on managing demand rather than generating revenue, and I've attached a copy of that letter. Unfortunately, I see a continual focus on revenue generation from both pilot projects rather than any effort on the I-5 project to capitalize on the advantages of tolling purely for traffic management. This region needs congestion relief now. If you direct ODOT to design the I-5 project purely for traffic management, you can drastically shorten the time to startup, produce a more nimble management structure, react to problems in a more timely manner, avoid unnecessary entanglements with bond investors, and likely result in more revenue sooner than if you keep on your current heading. Decide what to do with the Congestion Relief Fund after money starts to flow in, so that decisions are made purely to benefit traffic management in an equitable, efficient, and responsible fashion. Consider the same approach with the I-205 project as well. Thank you very much.
I appreciate you bringing these forward as considerations. As you know, we have a number of conversations in front of us still, so thank you for the engagement. Mr. Courtwright, the floor is yours. Good to see you.
Thank you. For the record, Chair Boehne and members of the Commission, Joe Courtwright from Portland. I want to thank you very much for your service. It's really in the best tradition of Oregon that we have citizen commissions like yours overseeing agencies. I'd like to be here to talk about the I-5 Rose Quarter project, but I really can't. What I really want to talk about, what I need to talk about is the failure on the part of ODOT staff to be, excuse me, very sorry. Yes. Thank you so much, and my apologies. The essence of democracy is transparency and honesty on the part of public servants. If we're going to make good decisions, we have to do it in an open, honest, and transparent way. In the case of the I-5 Rose Quarter project, what's happened hasn't served the interests of the citizens of Oregon well. What the Oregon Department of Transportation has done is to suppress basic traffic data. They released an environmental assessment that contains no figures on average daily traffic, the most fundamental unit that you regularly use to measure traffic. They concealed the existence of an assumption that the Columbia River crossing is built, and not built in the future, but built in 2015. That's the fundamental assumption of their traffic projections. And that's what drives the numbers that you alluded to in your op-ed this weekend. Not what's real today, but what it's imaginary cars over a non-existent bridge. When asked for data and plans on the engineering of the project, what it would look like, the schematics, McKenzie was told in response by your department that no such plans existed. But after persisting for several weeks, he got access to 33 gigabytes of plans after being told that no such plans existed. The department has incorrectly said a number of times that this is not a freeway widening project. It absolutely is. It's going to be a 126-foot right-of-way, which is sufficient to accommodate an 8-lane freeway. It's not just the addition of a few auxiliary lanes. And even Metro labeled the description of this as not a capacity expansion as, quote, not objectively true. ODOT has repeatedly said that this is, as part of its marketing materials, the #1 crash location in Oregon. That is not an objectively true fact. Other ODOT facilities in the Portland metropolitan area, including Barber Boulevard and others, have crash rates that are 3 times higher and that actually kill people, unlike the relatively safe and minor accidents on I-5. ODOT, in its preparation of the environmental assessment for this project, completely omitted any reference to congestion pricing, which is a terrible omission given that this is supposed to be a plan for a 25-year period. You cannot move forward with this project without including in the analysis of congestion pricing. I appreciate that as citizen commissioners, your job is not to undertake or second guess the technical analysis that's presented to you. But you can insist on the part of your staff, that they be open, transparent, and truthful in their communications to the public. If we're going to make a good decision, a decision that can be respected by Oregonians, it has to be done in a way that provides accurate and transparent information, and that hasn't been happening.
Mr. Courtwright, thank you very much for bringing this to our attention, and thank you for outlining the areas where you have raised concerns. Director Garrett, I would like us to talk offline about this too and be able to get a response back on the issues that have been raised. Thank you very much. And next I have, I'm sorry, is it Aaron Brown? Hi, Aaron, yes. Microphone is on.
Great.
Wonderful to see you. The floor is yours.
Good morning. My name is Aaron Brown, and I live in North Portland. I'm here to once again talk about the Rose Quarter Freeway Expansion Project. I don't know what your staff has been telling you about how the project has been going. It hasn't been going really well. There were 1,500 comments submitted in opposition in your public comment period. Joe alluded to the numerous problems that we've had working with ODOT staff. I would be providing you video of what happened at the public hearing that they had, but for some reason ODOT staff public engagement did not actually provide video at that hearing. Organizations and institutions that have called for an environmental impact statement as opposed to an EA include Portland Public Schools, Audubon Society, the Harriet Tubman Portland Teachers Student Association, the Albina Vision, Oregon Environmental Council, Oregon League of Conservation Voters, State Representative Karin Power, City Commissioner Chloe U. Daly. Everyone that's had a chance to look at the data when we finally got it found numerous discrepancies and problems with it. Joe alluded to the issues with crashes. There hasn't been a single fatality on this stretch of freeway in over a decade. We've been talking about air pollution. You know, ODOT's claims that somehow this freeway is going to reduce congestion, reduce air pollution, and reduce carbon emissions. These are things that not a single freeway expansion anywhere in North America has ever done. When I was born 30 years ago, carbon was at 350 parts per million. 30 years later, it's at 420. Last time I spoke to you, Chair Boehne, I talked about the trip to Glacier I took with my girlfriend. Since then, a month after that hearing, Glacier caught fire. Climate change is real. The IPCC report came out. In the Sunday Oregonian op-ed that you and Commissioner Simpson co-sponsored, there was language in there about, here's all of the minutes of time saving that's going to come with the Rose Quarter and the Interstate Replacement Bridge. First of all, as Joe pointed out, those numbers are horribly, horribly incorrect and are just like flubbed numbers out there to just sort of come up with this project. And we thoroughly debunked them, and I encourage you to look at those quantitative analysis of where they were wrong. The second thing is, I want you to stop worrying about saving those 5 minutes per day and start worrying about the decades of my life and the lives of current and future generations that are counting on the Oregon Transportation Commission to take seriously that there are 40% of Oregon's carbon emissions coming from transportation. When I look at my own personal budget and I see that I'm way over my budget and I see that 40% of my over budget comes from going to the coffee shop, it's time for me to get out my percolator. It's time for me to not every day assume that I can afford that in my budget. My budget requires that the Oregon Transportation Commission take climate change seriously and stop expanding freeways. Even if we got some bizarre world where Bernie Sanders and Elon Musk got elected co-presidents and gave every single person an electric vehicle, we would still have to reduce driving, particularly in the Portland metropolitan region. There simply is not enough energy for us to move 60 people by 60 automobiles instead of with 2 or 3 cars. The OTC has an enormous opportunity and the most carbon consequential decision in terms of choosing Director Garrett's replacement. There is enormous energy right now on talking about a Green New Deal and all of these big, this is a gray old deal, the Rose Quarter freeway expansion. This is locking future generations into a world in which we do not have the opportunity to feed the people that live on this planet. It is a world in which the town that I was born in Central Florida, is underwater before the end of my lifetime. An Oregonian born today is likely to be alive in 2100. If we have 11 years to solve climate change, I hope that every single one of you on this commission, and I'm not trying to be antagonistic, I'm asking and begging you, as the youngest person in this room that is going to be remembering this meeting 50 years from now, if I'm lucky enough to be there, what did Chair Boehne do? What did the Oregon Transportation Commission do when provided with these facts? And now, because I've been here, you can't say that you weren't asked to consider your own actions and implications. Thank you very much for your time.
Mr. Brown, please know that it doesn't appear as though it's antagonistic. It appears as though it's passionate and it's well thought out. So thank you so much for making time to be here today.
Well, I'm wearing a button that says, "Oh, don't." So I have a little bit of antagonism going. But
I didn't see the button. Okay, I totally take those
It's
comments.
benevolent antagonism.
Thank you so much. Okay, and last on this list for general public comment is Mr. Solinger, Bob? And if someone else wanted to sign up but didn't, please just signal and I'm happy to add you to the list. Good morning, great to see you. Oh, you have a button as well, I see it.
I do, apparently. Good morning, Chair Boehne, members of the Commission, Director Garrett. My name is Bob Solinger. I'm the Conservation Director for the Portland Audubon Society. I'm also here to testify on the I-5 Broadway expansion. We have been tracking this for a long time. I was on the Northeast Quadrant Advisory Committee a decade ago when this project was first proposed. And back then, we weren't so focused on these kinds of issues at that time, but it struck me very much that this was a project in search of a purpose. It really did not make any sense in the way it was portrayed. We've continued to track it through the Central City Plan, the Comprehensive Plan, and the Regional Transportation Plan, and of course through the most recent EA. And our confidence has not increased in this project over that time. It has decreased. The agency's had a very, very long time to make the case for it, but we seem no closer today than we were a decade ago. In fact, it seems further away for us today than we were a decade ago. I want to come here today because we were deeply troubled by the environmental assessment. I work on a lot of EAs and EISs. It's kind of what I do. This one, for a project of this scale and this complexity and this cost, was one of the weakest I've ever seen. It just simply did not provide the kind of detail in order to assess the costs, the benefits, the impacts, the alternatives that I would expect with a much, much smaller project, let alone something that's going to be $500 million. It was shocking to me that we had to ask for data, that we didn't get it till halfway through the process. And even then, just so many issues that were just glossed over or ignored altogether. I'm going to focus in for my remaining time on just a couple of things that I don't think have been raised by a lot of other groups, but I think are important to consider. And we are concerned about those other issues as well. You see that in our comments. But the agency completely ignored City of Portland environmental regulations, river codes, tree codes, greenway codes. They simply do not appear in this. You say the City of Portland is a partner, and yet all these regulations that are in place were simply ignored. They were not addressed in this EA. Endangered Species Act issues, that's something that is really glossed over in this EA. This is kind of a profound impact on our river. We have worked for decades to restore this river, and this is the most degraded part of it for salmon passage. You're going to be putting 11 piers into shallow water habitat. I compare this to example for what the Tilgham Crossing had to do to avoid salmon impacts. This project simply doesn't address them in any sort of meaningful way whatsoever. Are you going to have to consult with NOAA Fisheries? Are you going to have to mitigate for salmon impacts? If so, how are you going to do that? That simply doesn't appear. Lastly, open space issues. This project's being sold to the public as an open space project. They were going to create open space. In fact, you're going to have a negative impact on the East Bank Esplanade. That isn't discussed, but this will be shadowing over the East Bank Esplanade. And the green space that's going to appear on the cap, for as far as we can tell, there's no description of how it will be used, how you interact with Portland parks. It simply is just vacant space. And in fact, you've discussed the fact that you may put buildings there as well. It may not be open space at all. But as an organization that works on open space, has worked on it for decades and decades, right now we see zero value in what ODOT's proposing. So those are just some of the issues, but I wanted to get them on your radar screen because they haven't gotten as much attention. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much for that feedback and joining us today to make sure that we understand those concerns. Very much appreciate it. Okay, anyone else who would like to approach the commission for public comment? All right, thank you very much. We will go on to item C. We have a legislative update, or actually we're going to maybe, okay, Mr. Brower, please join us. So we are going to go on to item D instead and come back to our legislative update. So Cooper, if you don't mind, just let me know when Ms. Baker is back from, okay. So this will be the overview of the results of a survey that we recently conducted in reference to attitudes around congestion and tolling, and I do understand that we have one individual who would like to offer public comment on this as well. Yep. So that'll be provided after we have an update. Wonderful to see you both. I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Madam Chair, members of the Commission. For the record, I'm Travis Brower, the Assistant Director. I'm going to start out by giving you a brief overview of the results from our 2018 Transportation Needs and Issues Survey as sort of a prelude to Dr. Neese from DHM, who will be walking you through in greater depth a survey we did related to the congestion pricing process, tolling that we've been going on. We did that work as part of our overall public outreach effort to try to understand the opinions of the public, particularly those areas that might help inform some of the Commission's decisions and inform policy. I am going to be talking about the Needs and Issues Survey, and I should thank one of the staff who worked on that intensely was Tony Knudsen, our statistician, who is not here today to present, but wanted to make sure he got his recognition for the good work he did on this. I have really three takeaways from the portion that I will talk about today. The first is that Portland congestion is getting worse. I think you all know that. Second is that people are growing increasingly frustrated about this and want us to do something to help rectify the situation. And third, I think we're seeing evidence that as a result of that frustration, support for tolling and congestion pricing is beginning to increase. Though, as you'll see from the numbers that Dr. Neese will bring to us, it is by no means a popular option, but still there is an opportunity here. So first off, just for context, our 2019 traffic report that was done in Portland found that between 2015 and 2017, the hours of congestion on the system increased by 13%, while the total daily vehicle hours of delay increased by 20%. This comes on top of a similar increase that happened from 2013 to 2015. So you're seeing really just a compound interest effect, essentially, with congestion increasing greatly. What we're seeing is that as a result of that, the concern about congestion statewide is growing. Now, you'll notice this is very tightly tied to the business cycle. Back in 2006, when we were at a similar place in the business cycle with strong economic growth and low unemployment rate, we had a strong concern. It dipped during the Great Recession and has been climbing ever since as unemployment has decreased and as VMT has been going up as a result. What we did is we broke this down by region, and as you can imagine, 3/4 of Portland people in the Portland metro region are concerned about congestion, saying it's a very serious or somewhat serious problem. But also in some of our other larger urban areas, it's a concern as well. We also asked a question about whether it's more important to preserve or expand roads, and I should note that the Commission's policy, the Oregon Transportation Plan and the Oregon Highway Plan, are very clear on the correct answer to this, at least from a policy standpoint. The OTP and OHP say that the preservation of the system and safety are the clear priorities, and that we are to focus on those areas first before looking at ways to make the system more efficient through things like tolling or alternative modes or minor improvements. Only after we go through those do we look at capacity expansion or new routes. So what we see is that, as with the question about whether congestion is a problem, more and more people are saying it is important to preserve or expand roads, again, tied into the business cycle as unemployment fluctuates. We looked at Portland specifically and all of the other metro regions, and we're seeing that particularly in these metro regions, they are increasingly likely to say that we should expand roads rather than preserve roads. And yet we still are at a point where most Oregonians say that it is more important to preserve the system than to expand our roads. We asked a similar question about whether it's very or somewhat important to fund all of these functions across the agency. And I think this is a very Oregon appropriate response. You'll see that maintaining roads and bridges universally popular. Almost everyone says it's really important, and that is reflected in your decisions in the STIP. But then what we have seen is that in our most recent survey, reducing traffic congestion, which I should note is modally agnostic, it doesn't say that we're talking about expanding roads, that's a little bit lower down, is becoming a greater concern, with almost everyone saying that that's a very or somewhat important priority. It went up 3.5 points from the last survey. In fact, it used to be below safety and some of the other areas, but now is the number 2 priority of the public. You'll notice that slightly less popular is expanding roads and bridges. That's a more specific, but you can definitely see that there is strong public interest in that. When we actually got into the questions around funding increases and what is the most fair, it's interesting that tolling is not unpopular in comparison to other modes or other ways of paying for the system investments that we need. We asked people to choose one of these, and what we found was that support for tolling, 30% of people chose that. That's actually up 4 points from the 2016 survey that we did. I should note, whenever I say it's up 4 points, I'm not saying that that's statistically significant. It may still be within the margin of error of a fairly small survey, but it still is fairly instructive. We also asked a question about support for tolling, and we phrased it fairly theoretically. The research that DHM did got into much more granular, such way you'll see different results. But we asked the question, would you favor or oppose the use of tolls in your area to reduce traffic congestion? And what we see is that in the Portland metro region, we're now even. 48.3% to 48.3%, and in other urban areas we have a similar pattern. That's up 3.8 points from the last survey, and I think that that's actually pretty instructive. We have a decent high theoretical base of support for tolling, given that this is not generally a popular approach. We actually have a pretty good starting point for this. You may recall last month when we brought folks in from Washington, they talked about their support for one of their toll projects was very low, and they moved forward with it. And what they saw was that after it was implemented and after people could really see the benefits, that support increased dramatically. And so it's interesting to see where we are now as a baseline. Even after a couple of years of talking about this, support actually went up for a very theoretical approach. I'll turn this over to Michelle now, and she will talk through the research that DHM has done.
Chair has a quick question.
One question for Travis. on this last slide, which you just showed, maybe on several before that, do you break Portland down further, like by county, by area?
Chair Bainey, Commissioner Van Brocklen, unfortunately we can't. Our survey is approximately, I think it was 1,582 responses statewide with about 350 per region. So that is the minimum you would need for some level of statistical significance. If we were to break it down below regional level, you wouldn't really get very good results.
So I just want to put a marker in that we may want to do a subsequent more granular survey of the Portland region, because that's what we're talking about doing tolling.
I would agree with that 1,000%. And I've asked these questions in different iterations and have talked to other individuals at DHM about the details around some of these outreach strategies and pollings. And I think it's really important to understand the demographic makeup of those that are actually participating in some of these conversations as it relates to what Mr. Brown was alluding to earlier related to climate change and a lot of things that are of significant concern in the urban core right now. So if we can entertain a step to go in that direction and getting more detailed information regarding who's participating in these conversations, I think that'll be valuable information for us.
Yeah, Commissioner Simpson, Dr. Neese has pretty detailed information in her survey. I don't believe it's in the PowerPoint, but we can give you that breakdown and even give some crosstabs about what those responses look like.
And I think it would also be wonderful to hear your observations and thoughts of things that you would have as recommendations going forward, areas in which we might want to further refine the process.
Okay, great, thank you. And thank you for having me here today. I am happy for this opportunity to speak with you in person. One of the joys for me personally in my work is this opportunity to take back what we hear from everyday people who can't make it down here and tell you for themselves some of their opinions. Oh, okay. We're getting there. Thank you for your assistance. And I just want to point out that we did a couple surveys over the past few years for ODOT related to tolling. And today I'm going to talk about just a sub-portion of the results from those two surveys. And I believe the longer results are available to you guys. And so today I'm focusing on three areas: the overall attitudes about tolling along I-5 and I-205, support for tolling, and then some evaluation of information and educational messages that resonate with the public, as well as some that they are more skeptical of, and also a little bit about what the public's preferences would be for potential revenue. Okay. As I mentioned, we did two surveys, one back in December of 2017, the other in November of 2018. In both cases, it was close to 400 people across the Portland metro area, and we did the three tri-county areas here in Oregon: Multnomah, Washington, Clackamas, and we also included Clark County residents. When we're doing work, we're setting quotas by age, gender, county, and ethnicity to match the population. We also have differences in who chooses to respond. So in both cases, we spent extra time reaching out to low-income residents and people of color to get as many respondents as we could. And we also use weighting on the back end so that the results are representative overall of the region. Okay. Given what Travis just said, it should not be a surprise to you that people in the Portland region have pretty strong emotions about traffic congestion. Here we asked them how big of a problem. You see half say it's a very big problem. And when you see that strength of negative assessments, that comes with a lot of emotion. And in Portland, when we ask people over the past 2 years, what are the top problems that this area needs to address, it's homelessness, affordable housing, and traffic. So this is a top priority for people in the region. In both surveys, we break down people who drove along I-5 and I-205, and so I can look specifically at drivers, people who drove those routes. We also did some questions to divide that further into commuters. So there are a couple times in the today when I might talk about drivers and commuters, and that was based on their behavior in the past week. And so when we look at people who do drive along I-5 and I-205, we see that congestion has a real impact on their lives. About a quarter or so are using some other, or having to avoid I-5 and I-205 at least daily. And in this case, what we asked was, do you choose another route or use transit? But nevertheless, a quarter of the people are in their daily lives being affected by the level of traffic.
Commissioner Simpson, did you? Okay, all right, sorry.
When we asked in an open question, right, so giving them the opportunity to say in their own words what they would like officials to do about traffic congestion, half focus on expanding and improving the interstates or those interstate bridges to Washington. And another chunk, 14%, focus on expanding and improving other arterial roads in the region. And then if you sort of think about the top three options, there's 11% are asking officials to add multimodal options. I'm going to show first support for tolling in terms of people's initial reaction. So in this survey that happened most recently, November of 2018, we asked them at the beginning what they think, and we're going to ask them again later. But here, and it shouldn't be a surprise, and when you ask people from the very beginning, before they have much information, 61% are not supportive of the idea of tolling in the region. And you have a little bit of 12%, 1 in 10 aren't sure, and then another quarter are open to the idea, support the idea from the beginning.
Cohort collective, this is the aggregate, not just the Portland respondents, correct?
This is those 400 from the region.
Okay,
so all
sorry.
4 counties.
Okay, thank you for that.
So slightly different than what Travis was talking about. And I think, it's important and instructive to think of what are their first thoughts. And so one thing to know is we ask them whether they support it, and then we ask them, do you think it'll work? And those numbers look pretty much the same. So 27% supported it, and 32% said, I think it'll work. And which means on the flip side, half of people don't think it will work. And the question is why? And so we asked them to write that down. And here are some of the responses straight from what they said. There's a skepticism that it will affect anyone else's behavior, right? So you're not going to change other people's behavior. You're just going to make the experience of driving even more frustrating. Or okay, you will change people's behavior, and now the freeways are going to be blocked all the time, versus maybe right now I feel like I know the times I can use it, and that it's going to slow down traffic overall more. Okay, those who think it will work and who tend to also be the people support, they really like the idea that the policymakers and leaders are doing something, trying a tool. Let's see if it works, right? Because what we have right now isn't working. So then let's try some other options. Okay. When we tested a few corollaries or actions that could be taken to in how the policy rolls out, what we found was that the public was most interested in policy options that limit the impact on low-income drivers. So 48% say they would be more supportive of tolling if we could do that with the policy. And also another 46% would be more supportive of tolling if you also increase transit service along the corridors, right? And then some others that were maybe not as high of a priority, but still people viewed favorably was limiting diversion to local surface streets and having that variability to help manage the cars on the road. And implementing tolls on all the highways was not a very effective modification to the policy or an attractive one.
One of your earlier slides was talking about not utilizing the interstate daily. So was there a separation between those that were really taking the, going through neighborhoods? I mean, that diversion factor is happening today.
It is happening. I think that the sample size, we'd have to look at the banner points to see whether we gave that to you in the crosstabs.
Okay.
But I can look back at that.
Wonderful, thank you.
Let me just make a note of that so I remember.
One thing to note is that you'll recall that the mitigation strategies developed by the PAC are exactly those top 3 most popular options that are listed there, providing effective transit service, limiting impact through equity solutions, and limiting diversion. So it's interesting that those came to the top.
And then this echoes a point that Travis made earlier on. Even though tolls are not popular, when you ask people what options for funding roads are the most fair, in fact, they're in yellow on the left half. 49%, one of the options for funding includes tolls that they believe is the most fair. And that outweighs the sort of existing model of gas taxes and fees. Okay.
So on that slide, so what do you attribute that difference to? Are gas taxes and fees viewed as not user fees, and tolls are viewed as user fees? Is that what's going on? This surprises me. I mean, if you have a car, you have to register it. If you have a car, most cars, too many maybe, you have to put gas in them or diesel. So those are users.
They are users. I mean, I think some people really connect a toll on a road with the funding for that road. So if I'm having to pay to drive I-5 and then I'm helping to support the maintenance and improvements to that road that I use personally. So I think that's a piece of it. And then I think a much smaller piece might be those who look at electric vehicles and, cars who there can be some idea that maybe some cars are not paying their fair share.
So it's just viewed as more transactional? I mean, it sounds like that's what it is, that I'm paying for this and it's happening right here as opposed to I'm paying gas tax. I don't know where it goes.
Mm-hmm.
That's how I would interpret that.
Even though we're required
yes.
to spend it constitutionally.
Mm-hmm.
So I think where I was going to ask my question to this was, I mean, polling is polling. It has its own way of working, right? But
yeah.
I think that the main question is how many of your respondents actually even understand the construct of the whole gas tax and fee model?
Well, so we do know from our focus groups that when we ask people how are roads funded, it's a minority that even can say gas taxes. They certainly have, the majority of public has high uncertainty about how much that gas tax is.
And then there's another data point here that's going to come back to folks that are actually even from Oregon, and whether or not if those individuals, based on their previous home or where they came from, because their infrastructure can be funded through other financing mechanisms as opposed to just gas tax.
We learned that in meeting with Washington, who was touting the income tax and the property taxes that are going in to pay for road infrastructure, of which we needed to clarify. But I think you're right. It's an important piece. Right. Right. Sales. Yeah.
Yeah. Yes. And we did find, again, echoing the theme that Travis brought up, is that people who have paid a toll before are generally more supportive of having tolls here. And so again, also, if you lived in a part of the country where they routinely have tolls and you're used to that, it's not the same level of just that initial no. Okay, so just a little bit about sort of educational messaging and outreach messaging that ODOT officials might be using. I chose here to highlight the two that were most believable to people. And what I point out is that both of these messages have at the core that if we could encourage drivers to change their behavior, that is a good thing, right? And the first message in particular highlights that we know not everyone does have the ability. And I think that is important for the public to hear because many people don't feel like they have a choice in their driving, right? I have to drive to get to work and public transit isn't an option for me. And so I think it is important to acknowledge that and have that start of empathy with people when you're talking to them about tolling. I also here show those same two with a briefer description in the list of more messages that we asked people to consider. And I just want to point out that just telling people that tolling works is that second tier of believability, right? So again, I think you have to start the conversation given the lack of information and experience and awareness of tolling from that entry point of empathy, and can we encouraging behavior change would be a positive thing. I also do want to point out that commuters, shown here in yellow or peachy, depending on which road they commute on, are more likely to believe that tolling will work to improve traffic, and that it really is the only way to address this situation. When we looked at preferences for revenue, overall, again, it's the idea that people are associating a toll with the road that it is paid on. And so when you ask them where do they want money to be spent, the preferences are around investing back into that highway. There is an interest in safety, however, that might be separate from the road itself. So making bridges seismically resilient is important to people. And I think we all understand in our region, in the Portland region especially, how important bridges are to our economy and our daily life. I'm not going to read all of them, but overall, the point, again, being that there is that transactional direct one-to-one correspondence that resonates with people. So if you look sort of at the least support was for using toll revenue to build bike lanes and sidewalks. And I will note that people want those. That's just not necessarily where they want toll revenue to go to. Okay. And finally, I just want to end here with a little bit of that test retest. And what I wanted to just highlight, this is an online survey. People spent about 10 minutes with us. They read some descriptions of what was going on. They read some of these statements. And after that 10 minutes, 13% moved to support. So we ended with 40% support, 49% opposed. So again, some continued education will help. And at the end of the day, what also will help is seeing if it actually works. And in the interest of time, I will sort of briefly go through the key takeaways. People are skeptical, and and that's understandable. And I want to point out that drivers are already using multiple strategies, And the people who commute and drive along the road, I didn't have the chance to show you this data, they are the most willing to pay a toll as well, right? So the benefits that they could get from the toll are desirable to commuters and drivers. And I just want to acknowledge that my coworker Ann was a valuable part of this work as well, and she couldn't be here today.
So one of the questions, was there anything that we missed? If you were to go back and knowing now what you know, would you have structured it differently? Is there something that we didn't do? Should we do it again? Should we refine it and mine it down a little bit further into specific communities? Are there, what would you see as the takeaways in your professional opinion of the information that we have, knowing what we have in front of us too?
Well, I probably would throw a question back at you and say,
Okay.
what are the objectives, right? So what are the goals that you want to reach with future work? Because that really should drive the recommendations that I make. We did spend, for example, this was on the quantitative results, we did spend some focus group time focused on low income residents to hear more from them. I think it would be fair to want to look at some of the communities that those corridors directly drive through. So, you know, Northeast Portland, for example, would be a place you could do more time talking to the residents of that area specifically. And at the end of the day, I would sort of want to know what was your next step that you were considering and how I could support that. Okay.
Please.
Yeah, so thank you. What I would say, at least two things. One would be, as I said earlier, specific focus on the Portland metropolitan area and looking at sub-regions of the Portland region so that we get a much more granulated picture of what public sentiment is. What is public sentiment in West Lynn versus Beaverton versus Hillsborough versus Troutdale versus Gresham, that kind of, and maybe even further granularity than that, as you're saying, into sub-areas within those cities. The other thing is, based on what you were just saying a minute ago about if you spend 10 minutes with people, you can move numbers. That shows that in several of the slides in here show that this is a huge public education. So I would want to try to drill into what are the public's current perceptions, and so we could start identifying where the accuracies and the inaccuracies are, or the just lack of knowledge pieces are, so that we could start designing it. I mean, tolling is a new product for Oregon. Is basically, I think, what we have here. If this was a consumer product, this is, introducing Diet Pepsi, when all there's been is Pepsi. What is this? We don't know. We don't know if it's going to work. We don't know if we're going to like the flavor. We don't know anything about it. So I think that it's not a product. It's a service, and it's a fee. But for me, it's about when you have something that is brand new, how you introduce it so that, and that goes back to public education and understanding, and that's a long-term effort. And Travis made this point earlier that we've talked with the people in Washington State, and they went forward with tolling with probably numbers that were worse than these. And so part of the public education is you just have to introduce it and get people seeing it's not as scary as they think it is. If you can get there and get over the, you don't end up getting a constitutional amendment or something because you've provoked enough people to just want to go nuclear politically. That some of it will be just some risk in going out with something new. But I think that for the polling, I think it's those two areas, getting granularity in the Portland region and understanding what people know and don't know. So if people don't know, for example, how we fund the current system, and what the limitations are in the Constitution, which most people don't know, that's a very good place to start. Just some basic facts. I'm not talking about getting people to be experts on transportation finance. I'm talking about getting people to understand, when I pay this, where does it go and what does it do? Very simple ideas. It just tests those, through a set of questions about how are our roads and bridges funded? How is the money used? Well, just some basic things like that. How would, is it a user fee?
Vice Chair Van Brockman, we did some research on that as part of our road usage charging effort, and I will tell you that there is fairly/very low public understanding. We are going to be doing an effort around that around road usage charging and just general public outreach about how the transportation system is funded, that was funded by a federal grant. So we can share that data. I think we shared that a few months ago with you. One of the things we found as we were doing this is some of the concern about tolling comes from just a belief that we're going to be slapping toll booths onto the interstate. In fact, I think one of the things that we showed here was people say, well, it's just going to slow us down even more. And when we have dug into that, in some cases, it's because they say, well, it's because I'm going to have to stop at a toll booth and throw coins in. So we have a massive level of education to be done just in the fact that people aren't even aware about open road tolling and the new technologies available.
Yeah, I think that's really true. And as I was looking at that slide about, comments, well, it's going to slow everybody down, I thought everyone thinks they're going to be tossing change into a bucket. But I agree with you. I would say one more thing really quickly. I think some of these questions are important, not just for tolling. They're important in terms of getting people's knowledge up for kind of all programs. We need to understand that if we're going to do road user charges, people need to understand this. We need a higher level of general base knowledge. And if it's the first or second most important issue in the state with housing, we have to give the public a lot of information so they can be good decision makers. And if it's a major concern, they'll want to learn about it. I mean, it's not like trying to teach them about something they don't care about. They care about this. I think it's very instructive that we have in Travis's slide. I'm going to stop here, but I found the slide that is this one, the vertical slide, that talks about, percent saying very or somewhat, how important is it to fund, percent saying very or somewhat important. And every one of these is above 80%. That is, if that's not signaling to us that people care about this stuff, we're just not paying attention. 80% plus, I would say most people involved in the political arena would say, or in public policy would say, 80% plus numbers. Those are massive numbers. So they want us to work on this, and part of working on it is bringing them information so they can understand what the problem is, what solutions might be, what the limitations are on funding, how their money is being used today, and how we would use it tomorrow. So I'll stop.
Okay. I think you raise a great point, Vice Chair Van Brockman, because I think that may lead to some of the frustration that we see, that we've told you time and again that these are the things that we value. Why aren't you investing in them and making it better? And I think it whirls right back to the general population doesn't understand how it's funded, and they in fact are our partners in being able to get this managed and investments made. So I think the next for us is to identify areas in which we'd like to go a little further on this work, and that will help inform us in making good decisions going forward. Is there anything else on this particular topic that we wanted to note? And then we do have some public comment as well. Please. I feel like I'm...
No, sorry. Polling is great, but it's a snapshot in time, at any given time. And to me, when I think about this, it's the education piece that we're really, really missing. And when we're focusing on focus groups or we're doing this polling, it's a select amount of people. How do you get people to that level? Unless you're, and I agree, unless you're really into transportation, understand how roads are funded, you're not going to have a clue. So it's interesting where when I was looking at the transit piece of it, I would be interested in seeing with the new STIF dollars where we go with transit in the metropolitan area, how much build out we see that actually helps improve the congestion piece. Because when I travel, if I go to different areas, I try to use transit because it's convenient. In the state of Oregon, it isn't convenient, even in the metropolitan area. So I think as we build these things, it may even move the needle a little differently, and you may see a reduction. It's just a really difficult topic, and I think that we need to really listen to what the people in the Portland metro area say. I was looking at the statistics from Rogue Valley, and of course, we're opposed to tolling, apparently. I don't think that they understand what it's like to sit in traffic for hours on end, unless they travel up to the metropolitan area. So I enjoyed listening to the different comments from different people early on from the public. And this is really hard, I think, for us, because we have to weigh everything. And you look at the environment, you look at all these different things, but I look at the quality of life of Oregonians. And when you sit in traffic that long every single day, you lose a quality of life. I don't understand why people like you want to live in the metropolitan area, but that's just my comments. I just think this is a hard one for us. I think that for the commission, we have to try to weigh all of it, and at some point, you just have to make a decision and live with the results.
Excellent. And please.
My kids won't let me sell the house.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, I noted that Ms. Baker is back in the room. Would you like to give us a legislative update? Oh, I'm sorry. Yes, thank you for keeping me. Mr. Sworn, please join us again. And would anyone else like to comment on this particular topic? Okay, so go ahead and hit the button so it turns red, and the floor is yours. I know. Sorry.
What I was talking about, the Western Ontario, just think about that as 99 West. Okay, that makes it simpler. I believe it is the simplest solution in the metropolitan area. What I wanted to say, though, about tolling, I know it's probably necessary in some cases, and we've tolled things in the past. What I'm concerned about, though, is the philosophy of tolling roadways as a deterrent to the negative consequences of economic activity, maybe environmental consequences. Well, the problem is when you have taxes, then you have to have more economic activity to pay those fees and taxes. So it can be very counterproductive. And I think in this case, what I'm seeing here in that particular idea, I think generally it'd be counterproductive, probably could be needed in some cases, like in the Oregon City area. But anyway, and Mr. Van Brocklin, you talked about Washington State. I lived in Washington in 4 years. They have lots of money up there. They have a lot more than Oregon does. And so for them, spending big sums on certain things isn't such a hurdle, like this $54 billion on the ST3. And the $3 billion on the I-5, that's really a Washington idea. The CRC originated in Olympia, is removed from the actual realities of what we're dealing with in Portland. So that's part of the issue there. Oregon, I think, has to budget more carefully. So I think if you set up a tolling regime, some people also could say, well, there's a lot of money in there now, and what can we do with that? I brought up the tunnel idea, which, as you really delved into it, is a lot more expensive than it appeared on the surface or what they acknowledged. And then this I-5 replacement is an expensive idea. So that's basically my comment. Sometimes the government program can have negative consequences that were unforeseen. So thank you.
Thank you very much. As you know, we're trying to inform ourselves, and with your help, we're getting there together. So thank you. All right, anyone else who wants to offer testimony on that particular item? Okay, Ms. Baker, legislative update.
Good morning, Chair Bainey, members of the Commission. For the record, Lindsay Baker, ODOT Government Relations. So just a few things here on my list. I'm so pleased to announce, about halfway through session. So as a reminder, Sine died this year is June 30th of 2019. And I think last year we just rip down our 15 weeks into session sign because we have officially started our countdown. An important sort of chamber deadline is last Tuesday, April the 9th, was what we refer to as our first chamber deadline. So this is the date by which all bills in their chamber of origin, so reminder House bills in the House, Senate bills in the Senate, have to be worked out of their first chamber policy committee. In absence of that happening, those bills are dead now for session. This does not apply to joint committees, of which Joint Committee on Transportation is one, nor does it apply to Joint Committee on Ways and Means, the Rules Committee, and the Revenue Committee. So what we typically see around this period of time is all of the bills get posted on an agenda. A lot of bills are indeed worked, going to either the floor or going to the Ways and Means Committee. Some of them go to one of the Rules or the Revenue Committee to get a little extra life and a little extra oomph to see if we can get it across the finish line. So as of the beginning of last week, so right before the first chamber deadline, there were about 2,700 bills currently in the legislative process, with ODOT tracking about 860 of them. Once we passed that first chamber deadline, so as of Wednesday of last week, there were about 1,600 bills still left in that process, with ODOT tracking about 530 of them. So as I mentioned, importantly, the Joint Committee on Transportation, where we overwhelmingly spend the majority of our time, was not required to have the bills moved out of that committee. So everything is sort of still on the table, right? So the Joint Committee on Transportation has about 74 bills in that committee right now, and we continue to stay engaged on nearly all of them. So a couple bills, I'll just run through sort of my list of bills that we've been particularly engaged in this session. The first one I'll bring up is bills that I think I talked about last time I was here in March, which is bills about transportation network companies, TNCs, these are the Ubers and the Lyfts of the world. So there was a suite of bills all originating from the House chamber, all in the House Committee on Business and Labor, one of the committees that was subject to the deadline. As I mentioned last time, there's a couple of sort of competing, dueling structures being proposed. One is have ODOT as the statewide regulatory agency regulating at a statewide level, completely preempting any local regulation and local enforcement of TNC businesses. And the second was originally sort of proposed as being set a floor for what locals must require and what standards they must comply to, but that they are in charge of the regulation and enforcement. And that bill sort of morphed along the way into a little bit more of a hybrid model. Both of those bills moved out of the House Business and Labor Committee on chamber deadline day, so on Tuesday, and went to the House Committee on Revenue, where, as I referenced earlier, just to give it a little bit more time, a little bit more life, see what compromise we might be able to strike. So ODOT continues to remain engaged in this conversation, more in the former bill, particularly because we would be the agency tasked with regulating this industry, and we will continue to see how that conversation evolves. I'm happy to answer any questions if there are anything specifically on that bill. Great. This next bill that we have been engaging quite a bit on is House Bill 2007, which is the clean diesel bill. So as you may recall, we've had sort of similar conversations over the past, 5 or 6 sessions maybe, and ODOT engages in this in a few different ways. So at a high level, what the bill envisions and contemplates is phasing out of all dirty diesel engines, both from the heavy truck and also the lighter vehicle space over a period of years. As the bill contemplates right now, that would be calendar year 2029. All of these vehicles would have to be 2010 model year or newer. Also, that date continues to change. So as I mentioned, ODOT sort of engages in 3 ways in this bill. So one is our own fleet that we own that would be required to sort of phase out over time in order to be in compliance with the legislation. 2 is there is a section that would require a lot of our construction contracts, particularly our larger construction contracts, to have on-site clean diesel requirements. And then 3, ODOT as sort of the enforcement or regulatory agency, because the way that these requirements would be enforced is through the registration mechanism. So we continue to meet with the sponsors of the bill and proponents to figure out how we, engage in all of these different spaces, right? We would have probably costs and some resource requirements as we think about shifting our fleet, and we would also have some resource requirements as we think about changing the way that we do enforcement of registration. So we continue to stay engaged. That bill, as I mentioned, is in the House. Maybe I didn't mention, that bill was in the House Committee on Energy and Environment on the first chamber deadline. It moved to the House Committee on Rules, where it sits right now, to give it a little more time to bake, and we continue to stay engaged. So I expect that bill will move. We'll get amendments over the next few weeks, and we'll move out of that committee, and we will help inform that conversation. Next set of bills I'll mention are sort of what we've been thinking about as our speed bills, House Bill 2702 in particular, and Senate Bill 558. House Bill 2702 is a bill that was brought forward by the City of Portland, which in its original iteration allowed the City of Portland to designate speeds on facilities for which they are the road authority. That evolved a little bit over time, and we have really been using that speed zone roundtable that Paul Mather has set, I think set last summer, continued to work over the fall, has really been using that speed zone roundtable to act as a little bit of a sounding board on a lot of these speed-related bills that are moving through the process right now. 2702 is probably the one higher on the top of that list. So we've been engaging that work group process and have sort of pivoted away from the City of Portland being able to have authority over all roads in their, all facilities in their jurisdiction, and have moved to having ODOT be giving delegated authority pursuant to certain criteria to any local jurisdiction that wants to have a little bit more control over the roads in their area. From my understanding and conversations with proponents and with committee members, I think people are generally comfortable with that approach. And I think it's a really nice complement to the work that we've done in the roundtable as we think about changing our methodology, looking at more of a context-based setting for how we regulate speeds across the state. So I imagine that will be posted for a work session probably in the next couple of weeks, and that will be on the move. The next bill I'll mention is sort of what we've been thinking about as our package fix bills. You'll recall that House Bill 2017 was, I think, 180 pages long whenever it finally passed, and we all expected to come back over the next subsequent biennium or subsequent sessions and do a little tweaky around the edge. So we did come back in the 2018 session, made some changes, and then in the 2019 session, the agency proposed a legislative concept that again proposed additional changes along the way. These really, and I've been characterizing it as ranging the spectrum from true policy conversations to really sort of fixing Scrivener's errors. You sort of had a weird citation or a number that was transposed, that sort of thing. I think right now we're looking at about 15, 16 provisions included in that bill. As you also might know, there are lots of others that have been proposing technical fixes as well. And so there are about 12 bills right now in the Joint Committee on Transportation that are reasonably characterized and categorized as package fix bills. So the Joint Committee, similar to what they did in the 2018 session, is sort of taking them all as one conversation and sort of figuring out which provisions they like from which pieces. I will call the Commission's attention specifically to the conflict of interest statutes that we have discussed in some length previously. As I've talked with our co-chairs of our joint committee and membership of the committee, everyone is comfortable with what we propose, which is aligning with the Oregon Government Ethics Statutes in Chapter 244, just so you know. I expect that we will have an on-the-record conversation probably the beginning of May with all of our package fix provisions, and then it'll get moving through the process. The one thing I will note specifically is Senate Bill 450. So this bill was brought forward by I think it was the League of Oregon Cities and also OCAPA and some other folks around the least cost contracting provision. You'll recall that in Section 45 of House Bill 2017, there were a bunch of triggers and conditions that must be met in order for the subsequent fuels tax increase to take effect. One of these was having the OTC affirm that every single recipient of fuels tax was in compliance with least cost contracting provisions without providing really sort of a sufficient definition for what that compliance looked like, and without sort of consideration to the OTCs not having authority over regulating that space. And so we've been working with the proponents on Senate Bill 450, which is their proposal for how we fix that. What that bill does is it says that in sort of deleting out that piece in the Section 45 and more aligning it and mirroring it with what the requirements are around the local condition reporting, which is you have to be in compliance with least cost contracting. In absence of that, if you all hear from the Bureau of Labor and Industries that there is a local contracting agency that is not in compliance, then their fuels tax revenues are withheld until the point at which they can become in compliance. So that seemed like a really reasonable compromise, not sort of jeopardizing the fuels tax increase for everyone, but holding cities and local contracting agencies accountable for compliance with contracting provisions. So that bill was worked this Monday out of the Joint Committee and is headed to the Senate floor, and then immediately after that to the House floor. So it's on the move in one of our biggest, most important provisions. So those are sort of all the ones that I had on my list. Happy to answer any questions about those, or if there are other questions generally that you all are interested in, happy to provide some more information.
I have a quick question. As we're talking about the House Bill 2007, do we also provide information in terms of costs? And are we, because we have, we also have something there in terms of statewide initiative of that would be a change, but for us in terms of the cost for our fleet, cost of those change out, the cost to doing business, is that something that we also as an agency can give of our own perspective of what those impacts might be?
Chair Boehne, absolutely, yes.
Okay,
and so when I say we've been engaging with the legislature and engaging with proponents, that's exactly the type of information we've been providing, right? So twofold, looking at what our fleet replacement, retrofit, repower would look like if we're on that sort of longer term horizon. And then second, what the potential, I think, increased contract value might be. And I think that the problem with that is that the way that we make that calculation and the methodology is a little squishier.
Sure.
But I think, yes, we've absolutely been providing information in terms of what those impacts might be were this bill to pass in its current form.
Okay. And then also with some of our partner, like AGC and folks that are, okay. Very
Yes,
good.
absolutely.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Yeah.
Other questions or comments? Thank you for the commitment.
Absolutely.
I suspect that right now your personal life is not exactly what it maybe looked like last year around this time. So thank you very much for all that you're investing and for your details.
Thank you.
I just, the level of professionalism and the interaction is top notch. So
Thank
well
you. I
done.
appreciate that.
Yeah. All right. Next, we will go on to item E. And just as a point of reference, as we know that we have a transition in front of us and very difficult shoes to fill. Today we have an update on the process for the recruitment of our executive director. And so chair of this is Vice Chair Van Brocklin. And so first we're going to go over the DOJ memo and the process that was outlined. We also have a recommendation that Mr. Van Brocklin and myself would like to provide, timeline for additional recommendations, and then also questions or concerns from the commission. So wanting to make sure that you feel involved in this process, that we're getting to you the information that you need, and that we're on the track that you would hope that at this point we would be on. So with that, I want to turn it over to Vice Chair Van Brocklin, who's leading this effort.
So, thank you, Madam Chair. Just briefly, we, as you know, are in the process of ultimately identifying a successor to Director Garrett. Initially, we thought that that process might be completed by mid-year. We have now, as one of our steps, hired a consultant to do a national search. The consultant is Korn Ferry, which is a leading recruiting firm in the country and has a division for public sector hires as well as nonprofit organization hires. And so we are working with them. There are multiple steps to this process. After hiring the consultant, we have are working currently to do a significant outreach program to the public and to interested organizations and individuals to learn what kind of characteristics and attributes we would want to see in the next director. As the chair said, many of them, I'm sure, similar to or the same as the attributes and characteristics Matt brings to the role. Once we have that outreach effort well underway, and we are in the middle of it now, we will, our consultant will be providing a position description. We've not hired into this position since I think it was 2005, and so We want to make sure we're looking at the position description, make sure it's current, and then we will be doing the candidate identification, and by we, I mean primarily Korn Ferry, although we will also be looking at potential persons who might be interested in the role. One is, the chair has mentioned, one of the things we've learned by working with Korn Ferry is that June 30th is the date that Matt has identified that he would be leaving ODOT, and we probably can't get this search done quite by June 30th, so it probably is a few to several weeks after that time. And then after selecting, there is contract negotiation, and then the director position is subject to Senate confirmation, so we have to go through that process probably in September. So we will need, we believe, now speaking to the commission, to have an interim person or persons to manage the agency in the interim between Director Garrett's departure and the arrival of the new director. And that has led us to, Chair Boehne and I, to a discussion about what are our options. We asked our lawyer, Bonnie Heitch, to prepare a memo on that, which the members of the commission have in front of them, and that lays out a number of options. And I can quickly walk through what those are. The identified options for identifying an interim leadership for the agency are, first, we ourselves, the commission, can step into that role under current law and serve as the interim director-like function during the interim. That's option A, or option 1. Option 2 is under ORS 184-620 sub 3. We have the authority under current law to appoint a deputy director. We don't have a deputy director in the agency right now, but we could appoint one under law and delegate some or all of the director's authority to the deputy director. So that's option 2. Option 3 is to appoint an interim director to be confirmed by the Senate. Note the distinction, deputy director versus interim director. We have authority to appoint a deputy director. An interim director would essentially be a person acting as the director in the interim, and directors, including interim directors, are subject to Senate confirmation. So we would have to get the Senate to confirm our appointee. And lastly, we can seek a legislative change during this session to authorize the appointment of an interim director without Senate confirmation. So that would be new statutory authority that the commission would have. So the chair and I have discussed this, and we think the preferable option first is not to have the Oregon Transportation Commission run the day-to-day operations of the Oregon Department of Transportation. We think that would be maybe the least preferred option.
And you can hear the sigh of relief.
Look at people exhaling. And secondly, we think the options 3 and 4 involve action by the legislature. Legislature is very busy right now. I'm not sure they want us to come talk to them about either authority or confirmation proceedings with respect to an interim director. So that led the chair and I quickly to option 2, which is we have statutory authority to appoint a deputy director. We think that's the best option, and so that is the option that we favor at this point. And with that, I'll turn it back over to the chair.
So I think for the commission, in terms of discussion at this point, are there other points that we want to consider outside of the recommendation that's been made? And then we can also talk further about what the process will look like in terms of identifying the individual or individuals that we would, we don't have clarity for that today, but certainly that will be something that we'll be discussing with you between now and for the May to June timeframe. So other points for us to consider? Okay. I think we need a formal action on, I'm looking at Bonnie, do we need a formal action that is the way? Okay, we do not. So I guess it would be just heads nodding that this is the direction that we want to go ahead and that we would be appointing a deputy. And we will come back to you with additional recommendations on what that might look like and seek your interest and your input on it. Other points?
No.
All right.
Thank you.
Yes, very good. And thank you very much for your leadership on this. It is a lot of activity going on behind the scenes. It's almost like the duck, going across the water, and below is just this feverish activity. So it is busy. All right. So next we will go on to discussing the recommended next steps for the Oregon Transportation Commission action on the proposed intermodal facilities. And this is, in my 8 years on the Transportation Commission, we've had a number of items come before us. This is one of the more challenging ones, and I also want to take a moment and say to you, Eric, and to the team, thank you for your due diligence in helping us to be informed to make the right decision, and for keeping us informed as these processes go forward. So with that, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and appreciate the kind words. We have a great team working on this, so I'm just up here talking it through, but there's a lot of folks that are involved in this. For the record, Eric Havig, I'm the Planning Section Manager for ODOT, and I am here to kind of talk about the next steps within the Connect Oregon process. Just to remind ourselves where we're at, we came before you in February. We had a whirlwind session with a lot of information, project plans, reports from various review groups. We started talking about how can we get to a decision, and we really heard a couple of things from the commission. One, there were some outstanding questions, and then we need to kind of start thinking about how do we boil all this stuff down into a decision framework. And I think we talked a little bit about a matrix concept moving forward, and we have something along those lines for you today. So what we've prepared for you to really not take a formal action on, but we are looking for kind of an affirmation, very similar to the action you just took, and in support of this. So looking at all of the information that we have coming in and working with our Department of Justice and our staff, we think boiling this down into a three-step process really makes a lot of sense. And as we think about that step one, it's really about where are we at with the railroads around service viability? Do we have something that's kind of functional, rail car issues? Those were some of the things we really heard from the commission as well as our review groups back in February. That led to a series of questions that we provided to our project sponsors. They are actively working on getting those responses, and those are actually due, most of those, next week to us, so that will help inform. So step one is about collecting the responses to those questions and ascertaining, do we think we have enough support and direction from the railroads around service viability, potential rates, and how does all that potentially work? So that's where we'll have this is kind of the step one. And we're terming this a little bit as a pass-fail because it really is going to be judgmental on your part. Did they answer the questions sufficiently enough? Do you feel we have something viable to move forward? This is a stage if you're really not comfortable with where we're at with service agreements or viability from the railroad perspective or any of those issues, this would be a spot you can say, we're done, there's no sense moving forward. Any of the project sponsors that move forward beyond step one where you say, yeah, they did a good job answering those questions, things are looking good, then we move to step two. Step two is more about taking the entirety of their project plans and information into a collective view. So this is more about, do they have an overall good business plan? Have they made a good argument for what the value that these facilities will bring to the transportation system, to Oregon, economic benefits? And again, there was a lot of information collected and talked about. We'll also have some additional perspective from our third-party reviewer with the most recent information that will be coming back to those recent questions. You can add that information into your assessment here. Probably not the proper terminology for this, but it's really almost the gut check. Are you feeling comfortable that each of the project sponsors in their project plans and their approaches, have they laid out a strong enough business case that it makes sense to really go forward? If the answer again is no, this would be the good point to say, we just don't think this is viable, not ready, not ripe, we're not going to be concerned further. For any of the project plans that do move through those first two steps, then we get into what we call step 3. This is where we go into a little bit more detail, looking into the various attributes, benefits, and perspectives of the project. Project readiness, economic development potential, how it might impact the overall transportation system. So there's a series of kind of categories of issues, benefits, and questions that we can put together into really more of a matrix and a comparison. So what we're viewing is, especially for the Mid-Willamette Valley, assuming both Millersburg and Brooks would move forward, this step 3 would be a good way to kind of compare between Brooks and Millersburg to help inform and help you make a decision between those two. For Treasure Valley, many of these issues and questions will also kind of help inform, do we have enough to really make the decision we feel comfortable to move forward with Treasure Valley as well? But we'll kind of compare them separately. It really doesn't do any well to compare the Mid-Willamette Valley when you're talking freight volumes to Treasure Valley. It's a different kind of service. It's a different kind of facility. So we want to look at that as in a matrix to compare them separately. And then as you walk through those 3 steps, that will hopefully help inform a facilitated, logical, sequential way to take a plethora of information and boil it down into a final decision. But at the bottom line, we are still talking about taking a lot of steps, maybe even potentially leap of faith as we move forward. So with this framework, a couple caveats we want to make sure we call attention to. While we've laid out some of the key questions and considerations that you could use, these are in no means weighted, prioritized, or emphasized. Each commissioner has the right and ability to bring your values and judgments and lenses to each of these steps to make sure it passes through your filters. So we're not trying to do anything to box the commission into a priority order for any of the steps. Nor are these list of items and considerations the absolute list you can consider. If something else comes up and you think you need to factor that into your consideration or into your decision making, that's okay. So again, this is a framework to help inform and lead you through, but it's not meant to be the final hard-sided box as we go through. So you will have the ability to put your judgment and your lenses to these items as we move forward. Some of the information will be objective and a lot of it will be subjective as you go forward. And it's really going to be based upon where do you think we're at in each of these projects? Have they made the business case? Is it worth that next investment? Assuming we get to a point in time where the commission at the next meeting, potentially in May, if we can pull all this stuff together, make that final decision, we will then go to the next step, which is entering into an agreement, a contract agreement with each of the project sponsors that are selected. And that's where we can really refine and define what are those critical milestones and steps that the project sponsors will need to do to help you feel comfortable in managing the risk until we get to those final 100% agreements from railroads, from shippers, and know that we're going to have viable projects moving forward. So that's kind of how we see the process moving forward at this point in time. I ran through that pretty quick because I know we're a little bit behind schedule, but let me open it up for questions.
Commission members? Okay. Nope. Okay. Sorry. Okay.
So I think the
you've
question
been
for the
tracking closely
commission
with us, so thank you. I mean,
Yes.
that's it's not as though we're coming at this without the backcast of information, and so go right ahead. Sorry.
Well, I think really the question, if there's no questions for me on any of the content, the question I have for you is, does this make sense? Is this something you want to affirm? Making this public to our project sponsors, to our stakeholder groups, the general public, others that are following this process. Everybody's kind of wondering, okay, how are we going to get to this? I think this will help a lot of our, especially our project sponsors, but others understand what is the timeline, what's the process, and how are we going to go through this in a logical way to make that decision. So if this works for the commission, it would be great to have some sort of affirmation to that.
I think I'm seeing heads nodding, and I think it makes sense to also call out that it's not lost on us that the sponsors are putting in an incredible amount of time, effort, and energy as well to get our questions answered. And I don't want us to be so conservative and risk adverse that we're paralyzed in making a decision, but we do have a responsibility to make sure that we are informed and that we are getting information out while we're trying to also put that into perspective on the nuances of these opportunities. So I want to say thank you to the sponsors that are working really hard to make sure that we are informed. And I appreciate you working through a matrix that allows us essentially some stage gates or milestones to be able to make decisions too. So I just appreciate all the interaction that's going on behind the scenes to make sure that we have what we need to make a decision.
Absolutely.
Any other comments? This is a big one. Okay, I knew there was one. All right. Thank you. Please.
I think we have a significant responsibility to spend $50 million, $50+ million that benefits the state of Oregon. And I want to see really solid business plans. That's what I'm concerned about.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Okay, so Commission, I believe we are at the consent agenda. Director Garrett, I believe we have one recusal, but go right ahead. I'll
That's
turn it
correct,
over to you.
Madam Chair. So what I'd like to do is walk through the consent calendar with 3 separate actions. So I'd like to pull forward consent calendar item number 3, and you'll see that that's the resolution specific to the authority to acquire property. From consent calendar item 3, I would like to pull a specific file forward. That is file number 9356-039, relates to the Les Schwab Tire Centers of Oregon. It's my understanding that Vice Chair Van Brocklin's law firm represents or conducts business with those folks, and he will recuse himself. I'd like to affirm that, Mr. Vice Chair.
Yes, for the record on that file, my law firm represents Les Schwab tires on various matters, and therefore I'm going to declare a potential conflict of interest and not participate in deliberations or the action on this item, on this file.
Thank you, sir. So with that on the record now, Madam Chair, what I would request is approval for file number 9356-039, the Les Schwab Tire Centers of Oregon.
I'd welcome a motion.
So moved.
Okay. Any further discussion? All those in favor?
Aye.
Anyone abstaining?
Yes, I abstain.
Excellent.
Excellent. Thank you, Madam
Motion
Chair.
carries.
So now, with that, I would request approval of the remaining items on the consent calendar, item number 3, all those additional files.
So moved.
Okay. Any further discussion? All those in favor?
Aye.
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 Motion carries.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And finally, I would request approval, given the fact that there have been no conflicts or concerns expressed, for the remaining consent calendar items, and let me call them out specifically, items 1, 2, items 4 through 13, and items 15 and 16. You will note that I skipped over 14. We have pulled item 14 from the consent calendar item. It's not right to take action. So once again, requesting approval for the remaining consent calendar items 1 and 2, 4 through 13, and finally, items 15 and 16.
Okay.
I move, so move.
Okay. Any further discussion? All those in favor?
Aye.
Okay. Motion carries.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Okay, and for those that are joining us this afternoon, we look forward to a discussion participating in the Cascade Earthquake Response Workshop, updating ourselves on the Cascadia, what it means and what our role is and is not. And so at this moment, we will go ahead and recess for lunch. Thank you.